Hello everyone, welcome to our first Hubert A-Level Film Studies video. This is the first video in a series of video lessons that hopefully will shed a bit more light on our studies and also expand any discussion we have in class. Okay, so this is component 2, section A, British film, and the focus of this particular lesson or this video is on genre, which is included within narrative according to our exam board. Okay, so genre is a method of film categorization that defines films by a recurring set of codes and conventions or rules. Prominent genres include horror, sci-fi, the western, romance, comedy, musical, etc. A hybrid genre is a genre that blends or combines the codes and conventions of more than one genre. So on screen we have a poster for Cowboys versus Aliens, which is a film that combines the conventions of science fiction and the western. Should be noted that hybrid genres are not genres in their own right, but rather they're considered subgenres, i.e. genres within the larger genre. So for example, Cowboys and Aliens is a subgenre of horror and a subgenre of science fiction, or a subgenre of western, shall I say. So the genre that we study, we'll need to study for this module is science fiction, and the conventions of science fiction are coming up on screen now, and I'll just talk about a few. A lot of sci-fi films depict dystopian futures. This is a state in which the conditions of life are extremely bad, usually caused by oppression, terror, deprivation, or, as it says in the bottom of the screen, the unforeseen consequences of industrial advancement. We also see isolation as a prominent theme in science fiction films. The isolation of the main character or protagonist is usually used to comment on a social issue, but also it positions the character as a protagonist for the audience in a very strange, alien, sometimes literally, environment. We need a character on screen who reflects our lack of understanding, and that's where isolation can come into sci-fi. We have fear of the unknown, space travel, robots and aliens, and the one convention that really interests us at this particular time is the exploration of cultural issues. Now, all films do this to some extent, but science fiction and horror in particular are particularly well suited to explore cultural issues, and we'll delve into that later in the video. Futuristic settings and a what-if scenario, which we'll talk about later. Sci-fi films generally high concept and sometimes deal with issues of Armageddon and the end of the world. Okay, so science fiction is quite different from other genres. As I said earlier, it shares many conventions and many ideas with the horror genre, but Zayendin Sadar says about the sci-fi genre, as a genre, the space that science fiction most intimately explores is interior and human. To tell future stories, it recycles the structures and tropes of ancient narrative tradition, and to devise dramatic tension, it deploys issues and angst that are immediately present. So what this person is talking about is saying that sci-fi uses familiar tropes, themes, character types, narrative structures to comment upon contemporary issues. So science fiction is a genre that hasn't changed too much or hasn't developed as much as, say, other genres in the last 100 years of cinema. So we still see the use and employment of quite traditional narrative structures, character types, scenarios and tropes, but the way for each generation of secular sci-fi films are the contemporary issues they comment upon and critique. So, for example, invasion films, generally political in nature, depict outsiders entering our environment and challenging the status quo or way of life. So the films we have on screen, in particular Invasion of the Body Snatchers, They Live and War of the Worlds, all deal with an external alien threat coming into our American society, causing havoc and changing the status quo. All of the films follow a single protagonist who then, as a symbol of that society, goes up against and defeats the alien menace, restoring a status quo or a return to a new equilibrium. So again, the narrative structures, the character types, and the type of journeys and stories that we see are very similar, but the contemporary issues change each time. Science fiction horror. Sci-fi horror films are used to explore and expose latent fears that we hold in our psyche, and they take social issues and present them through the lens of horror. And we have robot sci-fi films. Robots have always been used as a metaphor for technological growth. So if you see a robot or a bad robot in a film, it's generally a critique of technology. And if you see a good robot, then usually it's pointing out or discussing the positive benefits of technology. So sci-fi is perfectly positioned to comment upon current issues and contemporary issues through the use of allegory. And allegory is found in most, if not all, films, but it's particularly prominent and relevant for our study of sci-fi. So allegory is a story that can be interpreted to have many different meanings. An allegory communicates complex ideas through metaphor that represents the real world or real world. Allegorical sci-fi films include Avatar. So if you look at the plot on the surface level, or what's called the surface level reading, humans exploit natural resources of native people, destroying their way of life and taking their property through force. The allegory is the US treatment of Native American tribes. When the Puritans first arrived and the settlers arrived in America, a lot of the things that happened then are reflected in the film. Terminator. An AI computer sends a killer robot back in time to kill a human to prevent a war, and the allegory is a consequence of unregulated, uncontrolled technological growth. James Cameron famously was a truck driver before he became a filmmaker, and he says he used to have a recurring dream about a robotic metal skull emerging through a wall of flames. And he said he'd wake up sweating every night. And what he realized was that he had a fear of technology in the future, and the idea that if a computer developed so quickly and so to such a level that it could think for itself, what would it do? And then he thought of the idea of the Terminator. So again, these films reflect aspects of our society. And a final example, District 9, South African science fiction film. And aliens land in South Africa and are kept in designated neglected slums. This is a clear allegory and a criticism of the apartheid system in South Africa. Okay, another way sci-fi is able to comment and critique current issues is through the use of the other. Now, the other is a psychoanalytical concept, and it is defined as the other consolidates difference as well as solidifies the norm. The other is used to justify the exploitation and annihilation of people. It is used to explain how revulsion and desire can exist concurrently, and it signifies an ever-looming threat. So the other basically allows things that cannot be represented to be represented, and it usually takes the form of an alien or monstrous force that represents a threat to humanity. It's an allegory or metaphor for a threat we face, and an issue we must resolve, or a social or cultural concern. So we'll go into the other in a bit more detail. Otherness then represents that which dominant ideology of a society cannot or will not accept but must deal with. So you have something in society that is in direct opposition to our mode of thinking or the way our society is established. Generally, we don't deal with those things, we don't accept them, and we depict them as an other. And this is achieved through two methods, really. Annihilation. So if we see an other in a film, we destroy it. Or assimilation, converting it to something else that aligns with the dominant cultural ideologies, or basically making it more suitable, palatable, and making a new version of it that conforms to our worldview. And the other is said to represent things that are not just external or outside of our culture, but repressed elements from within our culture. So again, repression, we start talking about psychoanalysis again, is the psychological attempt made to direct one's own desires and impulses towards pleasure by excluding the desires from one's conscious mind or holding it in the subconscious. So what that means is that if people have a desire, or they want to do something that they themselves sort of think is socially unacceptable, or according to their own ideologies and philosophies they see as a negative activity, rather than pursuing that, they will repress it deep down inside. They won't think about it, they won't act upon it, and over time the idea that repression starts to manifest itself in a very, very negative way. So some examples of the other in our society and how it is either attempted to annihilate or assimilate it was that in 2013 in Britain, gay marriage was passed and made law. Now, some people in our society unfortunately believe that homosexuality is a sin or immoral behaviour. So when it was introduced in the UK and then in the USA, some people fought against it, and as it did not align with their worldview. So instead of accepting the changes in society and changing their viewpoints and their ideas to move forward with society, so instead of changing their own viewpoints, some people chose to either A, try and overturn the law, so again this process of annihilation, remove the thing that they find offensive or see as outside of their worldview, or like our people on screen, who are UKIP councillor David Sylvester, at the bottom of the screen. What he decided to do was, instead of accepting gay marriage or a change in the law or a challenge to his worldview. Instead of moving forward and developing as a person, he decided to blame gay marriage on floods that had been experienced around the world. And we also have Pastor Billy Ledbetter, the first photograph, who, instead of changing his viewpoint and accepting the society's move forward, he still felt gay marriage challenged his beliefs. He was unwilling to change his belief. So what he's done is led a campaign blaming the Florida shooting, the recent shooting in America, and other mass shootings in America on gay marriage. So again, this is an example of how the other is also how things in society that do not conform to the status quo are deemed as other and either tried to be destroyed or assimilated. Okay, so further examples in a bit more detail. If we look at the Puritans and the natives, so in 1602, the Pilgrims, a group of religious Puritans, left England to set up new homes in America. Now, their intention was to settle and colonize the land, making it their own and shaping the world in their own image. Now, the Puritans followed a very strict Christian religious doctrine, and it was very, very strict religious ideology. And what they discovered in America was Native Americans already lived in the country and they had their own culture, their own societies, and their own traditions. Now, instead of living side by side, the Puritans began to represent the natives as others, people different from themselves. And one of the reasons for this is that as the Puritans were followed a hardline Christian doctrine, that doctrine dictated that their God was the only God, and their way of life and their culture and their way of understanding the very world and understanding reality was the only way, and theirs was the right way. So instead of changing their beliefs, so after being presented with new information, instead of changing their beliefs, they rejected the notion that the natives were civilized and that the Native Americans had their own cultures and history. And instead, they began to represent and depict the natives as literal spawns of Satan, who were sexually promiscuous, savage, and animalistic. So instead of admitting something that challenged their beliefs, the Puritans projected the things that they repressed in their own minds, i.e., issues surrounding sexuality, religion, origins of our culture, and even our species, and they attempted to annihilate or assimilate their repressed. So repression makes it impossible to have a healthy alternative to our own worldview. We repress the things we cannot or will not recognize as having autonomy and a right to exist or live life according to their own free will. Again, another example, the United States is historically a country controlled by white men, and we see many different groups of people repressed in media. And one group repressed significantly is the African American community. So in 1915, the African American population was about 10%, and certain laws were in place. So miscegenation was a crime. Miscegenation refers to blood mixing. So, people of different ethnicities being in relationships and having sexual relationships, that was actually outlawed. The Jim Crow law came into effect. There's no E on Crow, by the way. That led to the segregation of schools, public buildings, transport, and military. So there were many laws in place that aimed to demonize and create a system of inequality in the United States. Now, many people at the time wrongly believed that white or Caucasian people were genetically superior to all races, with people of African descent being the most inferior race. So instead of accepting the reality and changing their beliefs, those in positions of power position non-whites, or particularly African Americans, as others, aspects of our society that we cannot or will not deal with. So there was a clear process of either annihilation or assimilation in a way to restructure or reframe African American communities and people from the perspective of a white community, so it's palatable, basically. So Annihilation, Birth of a Nation, is a 1950 film by D.W. Griffith, and it presents the black other as a savage beast that hunts white women. In the film, this gives justification for the Ku Klux Klan coming into the film and killing, hanging, and removing black people, black men in particular, as a result. Another response to this was assimilation. So we start to see stereotypes depicting African American people as illiterate, unintelligent, as servants, and inferior. So this acceptable version of blackness for the time changes what being black means in the minds of the white audience and represents black people as inferior. So what we see is something in real life that people can't accept. They then assimilate or change its meaning to fit their worldview. And this is the role of the other in science fiction films.